All right, well, we are here with Rebecca Schaefer at the Durham Literacy Center, and she's going to talk a little bit about their evidence based reading class or STAR class, about how it works for them. They've been doing STAR now for, well, about 7, 8 years,
Yeah.
so have a lot of experience with running the classes. So, one of the big issues and one of the big challenges is being able to give reading assessments to all the students that come in. So tell us, how do you handle it at the Durham Literacy Center?
Sure. So when our students come in, the first process for intake is that they do a group orientation where they learn about the program. We go over the expectations that we have of students, the kinds of services we provide, and then we do CASAS or TABE testing individually. And so that's all done during the very first session. Then we invite students back for interviews and agreements, goal planning, all of those kinds of things. If a student, based on their TABE or CASAS, scored in that intermediate range of 4th grade to 8th grade, then we also schedule the oral diagnostic. Currently, only 2 staff members are doing the oral diagnostic assessments because we really wanted to make sure that we were both doing them exactly the same way with the same expectations, and the ratings that we were giving were calibrated to each other. So we handle those. We schedule those individually whenever it works for the incoming students and ourselves. And typically they now take about, I would say, 50 minutes to an hour is typically what we have. And that may also include an interview that goes beyond the comprehension interview part. So we may go into the goal planning and things like that, just to do those 2 things in one session. And when we first started, those assessments took a little longer. They were sometimes an hour and a half for a student because we were still kind of getting all the pieces together and making sure that we had it. We didn't know when to, there may be times where you skip a level doing the fluency assessment. If someone is just dead on, you may skip up 2 grade levels instead of going one by one. And at that point, we weren't doing that, so it took a lot longer.
Okay, great. So got the assessment time down into about under an hour.
Under an hour.
Okay, very good. One challenge also is, after we've given assessments to a group of students and we're trying to plan our instructional routine, how do you handle that to try to make things so they're not so complicated where you're trying to work with individual students? Could you give us some tips and pointers about how that works, please?
Sure. So we create a table where you have all the students listed on a row, and then we have their instructional levels for each of the 4 components laid out. And we also have their availability. So if they're available, we have morning classes and evening classes for our STAR classes, and they pick that as well. So we divide that first. Obviously, availability is going to determine what class you're in as the first spot. But then within those levels, we look to see if we can group people so that basically their needs are roughly at the same level, so that you minimize the need to do simultaneous groupings within one class. A lot of times you can't get around it, but in some cases, I was very lucky this semester. I have students where all of their needs are roughly similar at the same levels. So I only need to have 1 vocabulary group. I only need 1 collaborative oral reading group. I have a few students who need some additional work on rate and prosody with echo reading and things, and those students can stay late on certain days just to work on those skills. But it makes it really very manageable to have classes that are grouped that way. We're very lucky that we can do that. But in other years, we've had much larger groupings. We had bigger classroom spaces available to us, and so we were able to have larger classes. And grouping them that way, we were trying to keep students where we would try to keep students who had alphabetics needs in particular in the same class, and students who didn't in another class. For us, that just made sense in terms of the skills that an instructor would need and how much planning time they would need. So.
All right, great. Tell us a little bit about your instructional routine. How long is your class? How do you divide up instruction in the various components, please?
Sure. So we have done all kinds of things. We've had classes that met twice a week for an hour and a half. I've had classes that met 3 times a week for 2 hours per class. And we've had classes that initially met once a week for an hour and a half. Currently, I'm keeping my classes at 2 hours twice a week. So typically students come in and we start the class with about 30 minutes of vocabulary work. That gets students to come quickly because they don't want to miss taking notes on the new words. They don't want to miss that. And often that's a really fun part of the class. They really like the vocabulary instruction. So that's the first 30 minutes. Then we do 30 to 40 minutes of comprehension work, and right now we're primarily doing summarizing. That's a skill that all of our students need. And it's a skill that I think takes a very long time for a student to learn to do well independently. Then we do the last 45 minutes on fluency, which is collaborative oral reading for us, reading a novel or a biography, as the case may be, which is what we're doing right now. And that can go actually longer to a full hour, depending on how much time the other two pieces wound up taking that particular day. You could have a class that went 2 hours on collaborative oral reading, and my students would be perfectly happy. So they don't ever want to stop that. So ending it with that also keeps students to the end because they don't want to miss reading the book that we're reading. One thing I should note, though, is that part of the reason that my class is doing comprehension in addition to 2 other skills, which typically is not something that we would do, there's 2 reasons for that. The first is that my students, their comprehension levels on the diagnostic assessment were lower than both the vocabulary and fluency levels, the other 2 areas where they needed instruction. So as those 2 levels increase, it won't necessarily mean that their comprehension skills will go up or their comprehension level will go up as well, since that was lower than the other 2. The other thing is because I have 2 hours for that class and the other 2 skills don't take the full 2 hours, and this is the only instruction that these students are getting. They're not in a lab, they're not in other classes. I am going to take that time to do comprehension work with them. If they had the option of going to another class, if we were at a community college where there were a lot of other group classes happening, that might not be the choice that I made with them. But in this case, it works. So.
Okay, great. Now, it's so important that students attend class regularly for evidence-based reading instruction to really work. So how have you worked your enrollment policies to really encourage students to attend class as much as possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically our semesters are set up as a spring and a fall semester. So they've run February, usually the first week of February, through late June, and then they start again in the beginning of September, and then they run through mid-December. So if a student is placed back on the wait list due to attendance problems, they have a long wait before they're able to come into another class. So that's a really big incentive, and it's something that we go over in initial orientation, and then again when they do their student agreement during a later session. And again, when we tell them that we're placing them in this class and kind of going over the attendance policy. For us, the attendance policy is that if a student misses 3 or more classes during a month and they do not make those classes up, they can be placed back on the wait list. So there can be extenuating circumstances if a student has surgery and they're out for, say, 5 sessions. But they're willing to make it up. They're willing to keep up with the reading. They're willing to kind of do additional work to make up the time that they were out. If it makes sense to keep the student in the class, if they haven't missed enough material where they're not going to be able to keep up, it's going to be a real struggle for them, then we may allow them to stay in the class. We've had students where, because of other family commitments, they were not able to be consistent, but they were willing to come in on an additional day, another day, to make up the work with one of the instructors, and if the instructor had time to do that, we've made those allowances as well. If we have volunteers who are willing to work alongside a class that can work with those students who need to make up classes, that's even better, because then you can really target specific instruction that you can teach the volunteer to do with that particular student. But not everyone has that luxury, so. But I do think that the attendance policies are really crucial in a STAR class. You don't want to be spending your time constantly catching people up with everyone else. Things are cumulative. You want the vocabulary instruction to build on each other so that later lessons are referring back to words you've previously used, so that they're getting that repetition over time. Same thing with alphabetics instruction. If you've gone through the syllable types and you're into the prefixes and affixes, you have a new student coming in or a student who's missed a lot of sessions, and they don't remember anything about the 6-syllable types, you're going to be spending a lot of class time away from your other students trying to get them caught up, which is not ideal.
Okay, great. When you first started doing STAR, you really had to change the culture of your program because it was all one-on-one tutor working with student. And now you're doing STAR group classes. How did you bring about that culture change inside your program?
Yeah, so when we first started, we initially, the program coordinator of the adult literacy program here, Gardy, and I both went through the training at the same time, and we both started implementing STAR strategies with one student, with pre-GED students that we were already instructing. And so we were doing that one-on-one, and we heard what STAR was saying, which was that it should be class-based, but we continued doing the one-on-one because that's what we were used to. And then finally we got to the end of the training, and we're like, we really should try this with a group. That was constantly what was repeated to us. So we set up small group classes, which was tricky because people come specifically to literacy councils often because they want one-on-one. They have not been successful in small group or large class settings. And so we decided that with a certain set of students initially, we were only targeting 6th to 8th grade, not the full intermediate range, but the higher end. That for those students, their only option was to be placed in a small group class. So they had to take that, or else they would have to go elsewhere for services if their availability fit the times of the classes we were going to offer. And once we did that one semester, we haven't gone back because it's really, really incredible what you can do in a small group class versus one-on-one. Around things like vocabulary in particular, because you have these really dynamic conversations. People make mistakes that you can't always anticipate and that everyone benefits from. The power in having a student realize that, yeah, they're struggling with this, but they're actually doing great relative to other students in this other area is really great. Students encourage each other. You get this kind of group dynamic. People are calling each other outside of class to kind of talk through, can you make it? If you can't, could you get the vocabulary notes for me? I think those kinds of, I think of it as like having an identity of a student and as a classmate are really important for a lot of our students, and they haven't had that. So that also has been really great.
Okay, great. One last question. STAR asks us to use leveled texts for instruction in the various areas. So tell us about some of your favorite leveled text resources that you like to use.
We could do this all day. So the very first book that I taught in one of my STAR classes was Seed Folks by Paul Fleischman. And this is great. I think this is about a 4th grade reading level. This particular copy doesn't have the grade level on the front, which usually they do. But it's a great book about a community garden that this one young girl starts. And then each chapter is a vignette from the perspective of a different character in the community. And so it's a really sweet book. It's written for adult readers. And so there's nothing childlike about it. It's just a really great book. And you hear lots of different voices in it. So that was the first book that we started with. The next book, and one that we teach to almost all of our STAR classes who have students at this level, I believe this one is about a 6th grade reading level, is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And this is a really great book that's got it's kind of like a road trip structure to it. So it's this person on a quest, on a journey. And it works with analogy. It deals with all kinds of great big ideas, but it's got a simple structure to it. And so for students who are uncomfortable with novels because they don't know what to anticipate, they don't know where things are headed, it's got a comfortable feel to it, even though the ideas can be kind of lofty. And the vocabulary in it is great. Even though we're not teaching vocabulary from a book, it kind of plants the seed of curiosity about words for a student. So this is a really great book. And as a matter of fact, one of my first students, we were teaching vocabulary not from this, but rather from the Townsend Press vocabulary series. We were doing, I think it was Building a Better Vocabulary. And we'd done maybe 4 chapters of that book, and we started reading this book, and she accused me of pre-teaching vocabulary from the book. She was like, you did that on purpose. And I said, no, this just has great vocabulary in it. At lower levels, sometimes you will get students where their instructional level for fluency is quite low. This is a grade level 2.9. This is The War of the Worlds, which was written originally by H.G. Wells, but adapted by Mary Ann Evans. And that's a real page turner. It does have illustrations in it as well, but because this is a book that people might have heard of, and there was a movie, on television that they might have seen at one point, it's a great book for those who are reading at lower levels. Two other books that I have taught quite frequently in classes, just because the humor is great, is The Fantastic Mr. Fox by Roald Dahl, and Holes by Lewis, I'm not even sure how you pronounce his last name, Zacher, maybe? But that's a really fun read, and it does have a character who needs to learn to read in the book, and so people really like this one, and we usually watch the movie at the end of the semester too, which is a lot of fun. Christopher Paul Curtis books are fabulous. The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963, is a great book, as is Bud Not Buddy, another one by him. A Dream Fulfilled is one of the Townsend Press biography series that we read one year, I think it was right after Obama had been elected the second time, and that was a really fun read. We're currently reading Chief Joseph, which you could tie into current events, what's happening in North Dakota. And students have really, really gotten a lot out of this. It just raises a lot of questions, and students have done some research on their own about what's happening in different areas, and it raises questions about what's happening with Native Americans in this part on the East Coast. So that's been a really interesting read right now. And Who Moved My Cheese? This book is a book that I kind of laughed at when I first saw it. Students adore this book. It's fascinating to me how much students like this. It's an 8th grade reading level. It's written for adults. It's motivationally spirited. And so it really appeals to a lot of readers in a way that I could not have anticipated. So this is now a staple in a lot of our START classes. Whenever we have a group who can handle an 8th grade reading level, that's where their instructional level is for fluency. We do read Who Moved My Cheese. So, and if a student misses out on that book for whatever reason, if they join the next semester and there's too many students who've already read it, they pity the students who haven't had a chance to read it and tell them they have to read it on their own. So I gotta recommend it. Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford is a great book about the internment of Japanese people during World War II here in the U.S. And it's written from the perspective of a young Chinese boy who was often mistaken for Japanese when he was living in Seattle at that time. And it's kind of a look back at that time as he's at a much older age. And it's a really fabulous, sweet book. But it does have a lot of triggers, so if you have students who have recent histories of losing someone to cancer, you might want to peruse it first and make sure you think it'll be okay to read in the class. And lastly, this is one that I'm looking forward to do next with my class, As Brave as You by Jason Reynolds, which is about 2 young boys who go visit their grandfather, who's a very mysterious man with a lot of quirky habits. And so it looks like a lot of fun, very funny, and my students are eager to finish Chief Joseph to get to something lighter, so that should do it.
Well, Rebecca Schaefer, thank you so much for giving us some tips about level text.
Sure.